Imagine a treasure. Not just a chest of pirate gold, but the entire fortune of a nation, the gold reserve of a giant empire. Hundreds of tons of pure gold capable of changing the course of history, buying armies and overthrowing governments. Now, imagine that this treasure simply vanishes. It disappears into the smoke of a civil war, leaving behind only legends, accusations, and dozens of unsolved mysteries. This isn't the script for an adventure movie. This is the true story of the Russian Empire's gold reserve, which in 1917 became the most desired and most cursed treasure in the world. Where did this immense wealth go? Who took possession of it, and why are the echoes of this gold rush still heard today? Today, we will embark on a journey to trace the path of the lost gold, and I promise you, the end of this story will be astonishing. So, the year is 1917. The Russian Empire is collapsing, first the provisional government, then the Bolsheviks. Chaos, war, the country is falling apart. And in the vaults of the state bank in Petrograd, Kazan, Samara, and other cities, it is kept, the gold reserve. At the time of the revolution, it was estimated to be around 1,300 tons of gold. To give you a sense of scale, that's more than the gold reserves of many modern countries. In a situation where the old money had turned into worthless paper, this gold was the only hard currency, the key to power and victory in the coming civil war. The Bolsheviks understood this perfectly, but their opponents, the whites, were not sleeping either. And the center of gravity for everyone became the city of Kazan. Why? Because even before the revolution, during World War I, the Tsarist government, fearing a German advance on Petrograd, had evacuated a significant part of the gold reserve deep into the country, to the quiet and, as it seemed then, safe city of Kazan. Here, in the huge vaults of the Kazan branch of the state bank, about half of the empire's entire gold was stored. Almost 650 tons of bars, coins and jewels, the true heart of the country's financial system. In the summer of 1918, the civil war flares up with new intensity. A powerful anti-Bolshevik front is forming on the Volga River. Units of the People's Army of Komuch, a government created by the socialist revolutionaries in Samara, and detachments of the rebelling Czechoslovak Legion are approaching Kazan. For them, capturing the gold is not just about getting rich. It's a chance to gain international recognition, to buy weapons, equipment, and food. It is a real tool for victory. The Bolsheviks are in a panic. Lenin sends telegram after telegram to Kazan, demanding they hold the city, and most importantly, the gold, at any cost. But it's too late. On August 7th, 1918, after fierce fighting, the Whites and the Czechoslovaks enter Kazan. The first thing they do is rush to the bank vaults. What they saw there stunned even the most seasoned soldiers. Tens of thousands of crates filled with gold bars, old imperial coins, platinum, and other valuables. The treasure had been captured. Imagine that operation. The gold is loaded onto river barges, onto steamships. It didn't just need to be counted, it needed to be moved out from under the nose of the Reds, who could launch a counter-offensive at any moment. The security was provided by the Czechoslovak legionaries. For them, this gold had also become a kind of guarantee for their own future, a ticket home to an independent Czechoslovakia, which the Entente countries had promised them. The gold is transported to Samara, then to Ufa, and as the Reds advance further east into Siberia, to Omsk, which at that time had become the capital of White Russia. It is here, in Omsk, that Admiral Alexander Kolchak seizes power, proclaimed the supreme ruler of Russia. And along with power, he also gets the gold reserve. Now he is the keeper of the immense treasure. People look at him with hope and envy. After all, he held a financial tool of incredible power. Kolchak could buy the support of world powers, arm his army to the teeth, and seemingly decide the outcome of the civil war. But gold, as is often the case, turned out to be not only a gift, but a curse. First, it had to be managed properly. And how do you do that when all state institutions have completely collapsed? Kolchak's government was extremely unstable, rife with corruption and intrigue. Officials and military officers tried to grab their piece of the pie. Second, the world powers, Britain, France, the USA, Japan, were in no hurry to help Kolchak just for the sake of it. They were pursuing their own interests. They sold weapons and ammunition at exorbitant prices, demanding payment in pure gold. And the gold began to flow abroad. For example, there's a well-known case where representatives of an American bank essentially deceived Kolchak's government, forcing it to place part of the gold in their vaults under the pretext of safekeeping, while in reality using it for their own speculation. Contracts for arms supplies were concluded on crippling terms. Rifles that were worth pennies were sold to the whites for pounds of gold. Locomotives, which were essential for supplying the army, were purchased at prices dozens of times higher than the market rate. The result was a paradoxical situation. Kolchak was sitting on a mountain of gold, but his army was still poorly clothed, poorly armed, and often starving. The gold reserve was melting away before their eyes, while providing less and less real benefit. Some of the gold was simply stolen. There are many stories about how individual officials and officers with access to the treasury fled abroad with suitcases full of gold. But the main expenses went to the war. According to various estimates, during Kolchak's rule, between 200 and 300 tons of gold were spent and sent abroad. This is a colossal amount. But even that did not save the white movement. By the end of 1919, Kolchak's army was defeated, and the Reds were advancing rapidly. A panicked retreat to the east began, which went down in history as the Great Siberian Ice March. And along with the remnants of the army, with refugees, with the wounded, in frozen railway cars, travelled what was left of the gold reserve, about 28 train cars with the precious cargo. This golden echelon became the last hope and the main headache for the retreating forces. So, we see that the first, largest part of the gold reserve, having fallen into the hands of the whites, did not become a panacea. Instead of becoming the foundation for the revival of Russia, the gold turned into a bone of contention, a source of corruption, and an object of predatory interest for both internal and external players. It paid for a fratricidal war, flowing abroad and enriching foreign dealers. The main conclusion of this stage is simple. Wealth itself solves nothing. Without a strong state, without a clear plan and honest executors, any treasure turns to dust. The story of Kolchak's gold is a clear example of how, holding all the trump cards, you can ultimately lose the game. But this is only the beginning of our investigation. The fate of the gold that went with Kolchak on his final journey turned out to be even more dramatic and confusing, and the key role in it was played by the very soldiers who had once helped to capture it, the Czechoslovak legionaries. The beginning of 1920, Siberia. The white movement is in its death throes. The remnants of Admiral Kolchak's army, exhausted by frost, typhus, and constant battles with partisans, are rolling back further and further east along the Trans-Siberian Railway. The golden echelon moves with them. Now it is no longer a symbol of power, but a heavy burden and a mortal danger. Everyone is hunting for the gold, the Reds, partisans, local warlords, and even yesterday's allies. And the main players on this section of the Trans-Siberian were the Czechoslovaks, the same Czechoslovak legion that helped capture Kazan in 1918. By 1920, they no longer wanted to fight for the whites. Their only goal was to return home, to their new independent country, and they controlled the railway. In fact, without their permission, not a single train could move. In this situation, Admiral Kolchak and his golden echelon found themselves hostages of the Czechs. In January 1920, a key event takes place at the Nizhneudinsk station. Under pressure from the Allies, primarily the French, and in exchange for guarantees of safe passage to the east, Admiral Kolchak hands over the golden echelon to the control of the Czechoslovaks. And shortly thereafter, in Irkutsk, the Czech command hands over the admiral himself to the local socialist revolutionary Menshevik political centre, which in turn hands him over to the Bolsheviks. On February 7, 1920, Admiral Kolchak was executed on the bank of the Angara River. And the gold? The gold remains with the Czechoslovaks. They take it with them further to Vladivostok. Lenin's Bolshevik government is, of course, furious. It demands the immediate return of the stolen national heritage. Difficult negotiations begin. Soviet Russia is still weak and cannot fight the well-armed Czechoslovak corps. The Czechs, in turn, understand that they will not be allowed to simply sail away with the Russian gold. In the end, a compromise was reached. In exchange for an unimpeded evacuation from Vladivostok, the Czechoslovak command agrees to return the gold to the Soviet government. An official transfer takes place. A Soviet commission accepts the echelon. The recount showed that there was gold worth about 409 million gold rubles. This is approximately 315 tons. If we recall that about 650 tons were taken from Kazan, a reasonable question arises. Where is the rest? Where did almost half of the gold reserve go? Part of it, as we have already said, was spent by Kolchak on purchasing weapons and maintaining his army. Some was stolen, but there is also the so-called Czech version. Many historians and publicists, especially in the West, claim that the Czechs did not return everything, that they still hid and took some of the gold with them. This gold allegedly became the foundation for the creation of the gold reserve of independent Czechoslovakia and the basis of its financial system. Let's look into this. A specific example often cited by supporters of this theory is the creation of the Legio Banka in Prague. This was a bank founded by former legionaries, and it was indeed very successful. It was said that its initial capital was that very same Russian gold. However, official Czech and Russian documents do not confirm the fact of theft. According to the Transfer Act, signed by both parties, all the remaining gold was returned. Of course, one can assume that some part was stolen at a lower level, by individual soldiers or officers, but to say that the Czechoslovak government centrally appropriated tens of tons of Russian gold, there is no strong evidence for this. Most likely it is a beautiful legend that fits well into the overall picture of chaos and universal robbery of those years. But it shows how strong the temptation was, and how easily entire fortunes could disappear at that time. So the main part of the gold that passed through the hands of Kolchak and the Czechoslovaks eventually returned to the Bolsheviks. But the story does not end there. After all, there was another part of the gold reserve that did not end up in Kazan. For example, the gold that was stored in the banks of Moscow and other central cities controlled by the Reds. Where did they send it? They sent it to fuel the world revolution. Lenin and his associates believed that the revolution in Russia was just a spark that should ignite the flame of a global fire. They actively financed communist parties and revolutionary movements in Europe, primarily in Germany. Tens, if not hundreds, of millions of gold rubles were secretly smuggled abroad to support German communists, to organize strikes, uprisings, and to buy weapons. It was an all-in bet. The Bolsheviks were ready to sacrifice their national heritage for their main ideological goal. A telling example is the so-called Gold of the Comintern. The Communist International, created in 1919, was, in essence, the headquarters of the world revolution, and its activities were generously paid for from the Russian reserves. Gold was smuggled via diplomatic pouches, through front companies, and settled in Swiss bank accounts. It went to pay for propaganda, to support professional revolutionaries around the world. But the world revolution never happened. The uprising in Germany was suppressed, and the revolutionary wave in Europe subsided, and huge funds were spent in vain. They did not help the European communists come to power, nor did they help the starving peasants in Russia itself, where a terrible famine broke out in the early 1920s. Thus, the second block of our story shows us two different fates of the same treasure. One part of the gold, having passed through the crucible of the civil war in Siberia, returns to the state treasury, but at the cost of enormous losses and sacrifices. The other part, which was initially in the hands of the Bolsheviks, is purposefully spent by them on the implementation of a utopian idea, dissolving in political adventures abroad. The conclusion here is also obvious. Gold itself has no ideology. It is only a tool. In the hands of some, it becomes a means for waging war. In the hands of others, fuel for a world revolution. But in both cases, it serves destruction, not creation. The fate of the gold reserve at this stage is a tragedy of a national treasure that was thrown to the wind for the sake of phantom goals, while the country itself lay in ruins. But there were still other parts of the gold reserve, those that had been sent abroad even by the Tsarist government. Their story is a true detective novel involving banks, spies, and international courts. We have traced the fate of the majority of the gold reserve inside Russia. But there was another, very significant part of it that had left the country even before the revolution. During World War I, the Russian Empire was an ally of Britain and France in the Entente. The war required colossal amounts of money, primarily for the purchase of weapons, gunpowder, and uniforms. Russia placed military orders in British, American, and Japanese factories, and as collateral for loans and for direct payment of these orders, the Tsarist government sent its gold for storage in Western banks, primarily to the Bank of England. According to various estimates, gold equivalent to several tens of billions of modern dollars was sent there. This was the so-called military gold. And then 1917 happens, the Tsar is overthrown, the Bolsheviks come to power, and in 1918 they cancel all Tsarist debts. They declare, "We are a new country, we owe nothing to anyone." It seems like a logical step from their point of view. But the Western creditors, governments and private banks, thought differently. They said, "Excuse me, but what about the gold that we hold as collateral? Since you do not recognize the debts, we will confiscate this gold as payment." And they did. The British government simply seized all Russian assets, including the gold reserve held in the Bank of England. For the young Soviet Russia, this was a devastating blow. The country desperately needed money to restore its ruined economy, and its legitimate reserves were frozen. A long and exhausting struggle for the return of this gold began. The Soviet government filed lawsuits in international courts, conducted negotiations, and tried to reach agreements. A classic example is the Lena Goldfields case. This was a British company that had developed gold mines in Siberia before the revolution. After being nationalized by the Bolsheviks, it filed a lawsuit against the Soviet government for a huge sum, and the international arbitration sided with it. To get its accounts of merchant ships abroad unfrozen, the Soviet government eventually had to agree to a settlement and pay the company massive compensation. And there were many such stories. Almost all the military gold sent to England and other countries was used to pay off the Tsarist debts that the Bolsheviks themselves had refused to recognize. It was a vicious circle. But there was another interesting story related to gold abroad. This is the so-called gold of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In March 1918, to get out of World War I, the Bolsheviks signed a separate peace treaty with Germany. The terms were humiliating. Russia lost huge territories and had to pay Germany a giant indemnity, 6 billion marks. Part of this sum, 98, 5 tons of pure gold, was sent to Germany in several echelons in September 1918. It was a desperate decision, but Lenin was willing to do anything to get a respite and hold on to power. However, the story then takes a sharp turn. Just 2 months later, in November 1918, a revolution takes place in Germany itself. Kaiser Wilhelm is overthrown. The German Empire, to which the Bolsheviks had just paid tribute, ceases to exist, and to top it off, Germany loses the war to the Entente. And under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, all the Russian gold received by Germany under the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was to be handed over to the victors, primarily France, as reparations. And it was handed over. That is, the Russian gold that the Bolsheviks gave to the Germans to get out of the war ended up with the French. France, in turn, announced that it would use this gold to pay off the same Tsarist debts to French investors. The circle closed again. The gold was gone forever. Thus, the third part of the gold reserve, which was located abroad, was lost almost completely. It became a bargaining chip in a great geopolitical game. It was confiscated to cover debts, handed over as indemnity, and eventually dissolved in the vaults of Western banks. The conclusion of this block: in the world of high politics and big money, naivety and ideology do not work. By renouncing the obligations of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks themselves gave their opponents a reason and a legal basis for confiscating the national reserves. The gold that was supposed to serve the country's development instead went to pay old bills, becoming the price for the political mistakes and adventures of the new regime. The story of the Tsarist gold abroad is a lesson that financial sovereignty and international trust are earned over decades, but can be lost in an instant. So, let's sum things up. What happened to the gold reserve of the Russian Empire, one of the largest in the world at the beginning of the 20th century? It shared the tragic fate of the country itself. It was fractured, plundered, spent on a fratricidal war and a world revolution, and confiscated by foreign powers. Of the approximately 1,300 tons that Russia had at the time of the revolution, by the mid-1920s, when Soviet power was finally established, no more than 300 to 400 tons remained in the treasury, according to the most optimistic estimates. Where did 1,000 tons of gold go? Let's trace the paths one more time. The first and largest part was Kolchak's gold. It was captured by the whites, partially spent on weapons, partially stolen, and what was left after a long and arduous journey returned to the Soviet treasury. But far from all of it returned. These were the largest and most direct losses during the Civil War. The second part was the gold of the Comintern. The portion of the reserves that was initially controlled by the Bolsheviks was deliberately spent to support communist movements abroad. This money simply burned up in the furnace of a world revolution that never happened. The third, no less significant part, was the gold placed abroad by the Tsarist government. It was seized and used by the West to pay off the debts of the Russian Empire, which the Bolsheviks had renounced. And finally, the fourth part was the gold of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was paid to Germany as indemnity and then fell into the hands of France. The fate of the gold reserve is a mirror that reflects the entire tragedy of Russia in the 20th century. It is a story of how material values depreciate when state institutions and moral guidelines are destroyed. The gold that had been accumulated for centuries, that was supposed to become the foundation of the nation's prosperity, overnight turned into an instrument of destruction, a source of temptation, corruption, and political blackmail. It was divided, stolen, sold for a pittance, used to pay for weapons to kill their own countrymen. This story is a stern warning. It teaches us that a nation's true wealth is not the tons of yellow metal in vaults, but peace, stability, a strong state, and wise governance. When these are absent, even the greatest treasure turns into a cursed hoard that brings nothing but misfortune. Disputes about the fate of the Tsar's gold continue to this day. New versions appear, some documents surface, and there are calls to return what was stolen. But the truth is that most of this gold has long been melted down, sold, and integrated into the global financial system. Tracing it is now practically impossible. It has become part of a legend, part of our complex and dramatic history. Thank you for watching this video to the end. This is a very complex and multifaceted topic, and I have tried to present only the key facts. If you found it interesting, please be sure to give it a like. It really helps promote the channel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss our next historical investigations. And in the comments, let us know what other mysteries of history you would like us to solve together. What topic would be interesting to you? Your opinion is very important to me. All the best, and see you next time. Imagine the 16th century, a time of grand discoveries, brave explorers, and an unprecedented flourishing of empires. Spain emerges on the world stage, a true superpower whose might seems limitless. Its domains stretch from the vast expanses of Europe to the uncharted lands of the New World, from the Philippine Islands to the Andean peaks. Its fleet, the famous Invincible Armada, dominates the oceans, and its army, the Tercios, is considered unbeatable on the battlefield. And most importantly, gold and silver flow like a river from the Americas, filling the treasury and promising unheard-of prosperity. It seemed that nothing could stop this empire on its path to eternal greatness. Yet, just a few decades later, this colossus begins to falter and then collapses entirely. Spain, the possessor of untold riches, the country of which it was said that the sun never sets on its domains, finds itself in a profound financial crisis. It didn't just face difficulties, it declared itself bankrupt, and not just once, but a total of 4 times. How did this happen? How did an empire possessing literal mountains of gold and silver manage not only to fail, but to effectively go bankrupt? Today, we will dive into this astonishing and incredibly instructive story, which not only changed the fate of Spain and Europe, but also taught valuable lessons to the whole world, lessons that are relevant even in our digital age. We will figure out what fatal mistakes were made and why even the most fantastic wealth can become a cause, not of success, but of complete collapse. Let's start our journey with the first and perhaps most paradoxical aspect of the Spanish tragedy, the curse of wealth, which in economic science is often called the Dutch disease. This term describes a situation where a country, suddenly discovering or receiving huge revenues from the export of one type of resource, be it oil, gas, or, as in our case, precious metals, begins to suffer from the degradation of other sectors of its economy. Imagine, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, after the voyages of Columbus, Magellan, Cortés, and Pizarro, Spanish conquistadors actively explored the New World. Their goal was not only the colonization of new territories and the spread of Christianity, but also, let's be honest, primarily the extraction of precious metals. And fortune smiled upon them in an unprecedented way. The discovery of colossal silver mines, such as Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, then part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, became a veritable gold mine, or rather a silver one. This was an entire mountain range, literally laced with veins of pure silver. Over a century and a half, from 1500 to 1650, a truly astronomical amount of precious metals flowed into Spain from the American colonies. According to various but highly authoritative estimates, this constituted up to 80 of the entire world's silver supply and a significant portion of its gold at the time. Just imagine the scale. These weren't just chests of coins, these were entire galleons loaded to the brim with ingots, regularly crossing the Atlantic Ocean, delivering unheard-of wealth to Seville. One would think that in such a situation, the country should have become an absolute economic leader. One might expect Spain to use these unprecedented revenues for comprehensive development, building modern factories and manufactures, introducing advanced agricultural technologies, erecting new ports, roads, and universities that would bring stable income and create prosperity for decades, even centuries to come. However, the Spanish monarchs, primarily Charles IV and his son Philip II, succumbed to the temptation of easy money. They chose the path of financing current, sometimes very ambitious but largely unproductive projects. And the main such project was endless and costly wars. Let's look at specific examples. Charles V, being not only King of Spain but also Holy Roman Emperor, was constantly drawn into conflicts all over Europe. He fought with France for control of Italy, with Protestant princes in Germany, and with the Ottoman Empire, which threatened the eastern borders of his domains and the Mediterranean. Each of these conflicts required colossal financial investments. Mercenary armies were incredibly expensive. They had to be paid, fed, equipped with weapons and ammunition. And after Charles V, Philip II ascended the throne and continued this policy. He fought with the rebellious Protestant Netherlands, which sought independence, supported Catholic forces in France during the religious wars, continued the struggle with the Ottoman Empire, and, of course, attempted to invade England with his famous but ultimately doomed Invincible Armada. Each of these military conflicts required enormous, simply incredible financial resources. Mercenaries, the construction and outfitting of warships, artillery, gunpowder, provisions for huge armies, all this cost a fortune. American silver allowed the kings not to worry about where to get the funds. Why raise taxes if you can just wait for the next fleet from the New World? Why develop your own production if you can buy everything you need abroad? And herein lies the tragedy. While in England, France, and especially the Netherlands, manufactures were actively developing, these were large workshops where workers, often by hand or with simple mechanisms, produced goods in large volumes. Spain practically ignored this process. In England, the production of woolen cloth flourished. In the Netherlands, textiles and shipbuilding. In Italy, banking and luxury goods. And in Spain? Why develop your own, labour-intensive and often less efficient textile industry if you can simply buy high-quality English or Flemish wool for American silver? Why build complex and expensive military or merchant ships if you can order them from the Dutch or Italians or simply hire their fleet for the same money? Spanish kings and nobility grew accustomed to easy money. They saw silver not as capital for investment, but as a means of payment. As a result, while European competitors were building the foundation of their future economies, investing in new technologies, developing workshops and factories, improving trade routes and banking systems, Spain remained a kind of resource appendage to itself. Only instead of exporting raw materials, like timber or coal, it exported money, receiving in return finished products and services produced in other countries. This led to the Spanish economy not developing, and its own producers, the few who tried to compete, could not withstand competition with more efficient and cheaper goods coming from abroad. The Spaniards found themselves trapped. They had money but had no domestic production of goods, aside from those extracted in the colonies. The conclusion from this first part of our story is obvious and very important. Excessive wealth, if not directed towards creating a sustainable productive base, developing one's own potential, and diversifying the economy, becomes not an asset but a liability. It paralyzes internal development, creates dependence on external supplies, and ultimately undermines the country's economic stability. This curse of wealth lies in the fact that it removes the incentive for internal change and innovation. If there is easy money, why bother? Why introduce new technologies, increase efficiency, if you can simply buy what you need or borrow money? This is how Spain began to undermine the foundations of its own economic future, laying the groundwork for future, much more serious crises. And this process could not pass without a trace. It led us to the next aspect, which directly followed from this situation: inflation. The second grand problem that shook Spain and was a direct consequence of the influx of American silver was hyperinflation, or, as contemporaries called it, the price revolution. Imagine that into any economy, suddenly, as if from a cornucopia, a huge amount of money is poured. But this quantity of money is not supported by a corresponding growth in the production of goods and services. What happens? In accordance with basic economic laws, the value of the money itself begins to fall rapidly, and the prices of absolutely all goods and services around begin to rise. In the 16th century, this is exactly what happened to Spain, and to a lesser extent to all of Europe. The flows of silver from the New World were so colossal that they literally devalued the currency. Precious metals, gold and silver, are, in essence, also a commodity. Their value, like that of any other commodity, is determined by the relationship between supply and demand. The more of this commodity, eyeing silver, on the market, the less its value in terms of real goods and services. When silver became hundreds of times more abundant, its purchasing power fell. And the fall in the purchasing power of money is inflation. Let's look at specific, very clear examples. The price of grain, one of the most basic foodstuffs in Spain, rose several times faster than in neighbouring France or England. If we take the period from the beginning of the 16th century to its end, prices for basic goods in Spain increased approximately 4 to 5 times. This means that if in 1500 one coin could buy a bag of grain, by 1600 the same coin was barely enough for a quarter of a bag. Imagine your daily bread, which today costs, say, 100 rubles, in a few years costing 400 or 500. And your salary, if it grows at all, grows much, much slower or remains stagnant. This had catastrophic consequences for ordinary Spaniards, peasants who grew crops, artisans who produced goods, workers hired in mines or ports, all found themselves in an extremely difficult position. Their incomes were devalued literally before their eyes, and they could no longer afford even the basic things that were recently available. Many farmers were forced to abandon their lands because growing crops became unprofitable. The costs of seeds, tools, and labour grew faster than the income from sales. These ruined peasants swelled the ranks of the poor in cities, creating social tension and unemployment problems. Cities became overcrowded with beggars, crime increased, and social discontent grew. Moreover, this inflation dealt a crushing blow to the few Spanish producers who were still trying to produce something within the country. Imagine a Spanish wool producer. Due to rising prices, he has to pay more to his workers, more for sheep, tools, dyes. Accordingly, his finished woolen cloth will be more expensive, and therefore buyers, both domestically and abroad, will prefer cheaper and possibly higher quality English or Flemish wool. Spanish exports shrank, while imports, goods from other less inflation-affected countries, increased. And all these imports were paid for with the same devalued American silver, which thus flowed out of the country even faster. A real vicious circle emerged. The more silver came from America, the more the money inside Spain devalued, the higher prices rose, the worse it was for Spanish producers, and the more silver flowed abroad to buy foreign goods. This was not just an economic phenomenon, it was a genuine destruction of the economy from within. And even the royal treasury, despite the flows of silver, suffered from this situation. Royal expenditures on maintaining the court, the army, construction also grew due to inflation. The same military campaigns we discussed earlier now required many more coins to pay soldiers' salaries or buy gunpowder. This forced the kings to constantly seek new sources of financing, which leads us to the third, most fatal and dramatic problem. The conclusion from this part of the story is clear. Uncontrolled inflation, caused by an excess of money without adequate growth in the production of goods and services, destroys the economy from within, impoverishes the population, destroys the competitiveness of national producers, and generates social instability. This was not just an economic crisis, it was a deep social and political crisis that undermined the very foundations of Spanish society. People lost faith in stability, in the future, in the possibility of earning an honest living, and this created fertile ground for general decline and discontent. And so we come to the culmination of the Spanish tragedy, a series of state bankruptcies that finally crippled the Spanish Empire and entered history as the brightest example of financial irresponsibility. When revenues from the colonies, despite their seeming grandeur, could not cover the constantly growing expenditures on endless wars, maintaining an excessively bloated royal court and compensating for rising prices due to inflation, the Spanish kings began to actively borrow, and not just borrow, but take on huge, colossal debts from the most influential and wealthy European bankers and trading houses of the time. Among them were the famous Fuggers from Germany, Genoese bankers, as well as Dutch and Flemish financial houses. Imagine this situation. The king, instead of pursuing a strict budgetary policy, cutting expenses, or developing the internal economy to increase tax revenues, simply takes out new and new loans. He hopes that tomorrow another caravan with silver will arrive from America, and this will allow him to cover all debts. But tomorrow often did not come, or the silver was insufficient, or it had already managed to devalue due to the same inflation. This led to Spain, being the richest empire in the world in terms of the volume of incoming precious metals, becoming a chronic debtor living in constant financial fever, and this financial fever led to catastrophic consequences. From 1557 to 1607, Spain declared itself bankrupt a total of 4 times. Just think about these dates. 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Each time it was a blow, not only to the Spanish economy, but to the entire European financial system. What does state bankruptcy, or, as it is now called, default, mean? It is when a country declares that it cannot and will not repay its debts to creditors according to the original terms. It is tantamount to a major bankrupt declaring himself insolvent. This was a disaster for everyone. For creditors, such as the mighty Fugger family from Augsburg, it meant the loss of huge sums of money they had lent to the Spanish crown against the security of future silver receipts. Some of these banking houses, due to the Spanish defaults, found themselves on the verge of complete ruin. For Spain itself, it meant that its reputation on the world financial market was completely undermined. No one wanted to give it new loans, or they did, but at exorbitant, simply usurious interest rates, which only drove the country deeper into the debt pit. It was a vicious circle from which there was practically no escape. Let's look at a specific, very illustrative example, the default of 1575. At this time, Philip II was waging a very difficult and costly war with the rebellious provinces of the Netherlands. Spanish soldiers, who were the heart and backbone of the famous Spanish tercios, went for months without pay. When news of the crown's bankruptcy arrived, their patience snapped. The soldiers simply stopped obeying orders and in some cases even staged large-scale mutinies and riots. The most famous and tragic example is the Spanish Fury in Antwerp in November 1576. Unpaid Spanish soldiers sacked one of the richest trading cities in Europe, killing thousands of civilians. This event not only became a terrible humanitarian catastrophe, but also further alienated the Netherlands from the Spanish crown, strengthening their resolve to fight for full independence. The economic consequences of these bankruptcies were terrible. A slowdown in all trade, a drop in investment, a general decline in production and prosperity. Each default was like a hammer blow to the fragile financial state of the empire. Instead of developing steadily, Spain was constantly battling financial chaos, losing trust and funds. The main conclusion of this, perhaps the most dramatic part of our story, is extremely important. Thoughtless extravagance, excessive spending financed by endless borrowing, and a complete lack of budgetary discipline inevitably lead to financial collapse, even if the country seems incredibly rich at first glance. Spain, possessing everything necessary for prosperity, colonies, flows of silver, a mighty fleet and army, essentially strangled itself with its own hands. It became a victim of the illusion of wealth, not understanding that true sustainable prosperity is built not on temporary abundance, but on rational management, investment in one's own development, innovation, and competent planning. So we have traced three key interconnected steps that, like steps downward, led to the financial collapse of the once great Spanish Empire. First, the curse of wealth, or Dutch disease. When the abundance of American silver was not directed towards developing its own industry, agriculture, and infrastructure. Instead, easy money financed endless, draining wars and a bloated royal court. Spain, instead of becoming a centre of production and innovation, turned into a huge transit wallet from which precious metals flowed to other European countries. This stimulated their economies, while Spanish industry stagnated, and local producers could not compete with cheaper and higher quality imported goods. Spain effectively became dependent on other countries, buying from them almost everything it needed. The second cause, hyperinflation, or the price revolution. The huge amount of silver that poured into Europe, especially Spain, devalued money. For the same volume of silver, one could now buy far fewer goods. This led to a rapid rise in the price of everything, from bread to weapons. Inflation hit the population's purchasing power, impoverishing ordinary people and creating mass discontent. It made Spanish exports uncompetitive on the world market, further increasing dependence on imports. The economy was corroded from within by this process, which created a vicious circle. The more silver came in, the more it devalued, and the more money the crown needed to maintain its expenditures, which only intensified inflation. And finally, the third fatal mistake, the series of state bankruptcies. The crown's inability to cover its constantly growing expenditures with devalued silver and a stagnant, inefficient economy forced the Spanish kings to take out ever new, huge loans from European bankers. When these debts became unmanageable, Spain declared default, that is, refused its obligations. This destroyed its international reputation, undermined investor confidence, and further exacerbated the economic crisis, as new loans were given either at incredibly high interest rates or not given at all. These bankruptcies had not only financial but also social consequences, leading to soldier mutinies, mass unrest, and general decline. In the end, the history of 16th century Spain is not just a collection of historical facts and figures. It is a powerful, instructive, and unfortunately often repeated lesson for any state, for any organization, and essentially for any person managing resources. It shows us that wealth itself, its presence, is not a guarantee of success, stability, or prosperity. On the contrary, it can become a cause of collapse if there is no competent management, foresight, and strict discipline. Spain possessed all the resources to become the undisputed and prosperous leader of the world for many centuries, but missed this grand opportunity due to a series of fatal errors in economic and financial policy. This story is relevant today. It resonates with modern economic challenges. Today, many countries rich in natural resources such as oil, gas, or minerals face the risk of falling into the same Dutch disease. If these countries do not diversify their economies, do not invest in the development of new technologies, industry, and education, they risk remaining dependent on a single resource, making them vulnerable to fluctuations in world prices. Excessive printing of money by central banks without adequate growth in the real production of goods and services can lead to the same inflation that undermines the welfare of citizens. And thoughtless accumulation of debt, whether by the state, corporations, or even private individuals, ultimately inevitably leads to a financial crisis and, in the worst case, to default. The history of Spanish bankruptcy teaches us fundamental principles: the importance of long-term planning, strict financial discipline, constant investment in human capital development and innovation. It reminds us that the true power and resilience of a country lies not in mountains of gold or oil wells, but in its own people, their knowledge, skills, their labour, in the development of advanced technologies, and in the creation of a complex, diverse economy. If the Spanish kings had invested their untold wealth in developing manufactures, stimulating inventions, in educating their citizens, in building efficient infrastructure, if they had created favourable conditions for entrepreneurship, and not only financed wars and bought foreign goods, the history of Spain, and perhaps all of Europe, could have been completely different. This lesson remains incredibly relevant to this day, reminding all of us that the path to sustainable prosperity lies through the wise management of resources, the creation of real value, the encouragement of labour and creativity, and care for future generations, and not through wastefulness, the pursuit of easy money and the illusion of endless abundance. 16th century Spain is a clear, very vivid, and unfortunately tragic example of how one can lose everything while possessing literally everything one could wish for. I hope this deep historical excursion has made you think and perhaps reconsider your own views on economics, resource management, and the value of true wealth. If you enjoyed learning this fascinating and instructive story, don't forget to like this video so I know you appreciate this kind of content. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos, and share this video with friends who might find this topic interesting. And of course, write in the comments what other historical lessons or economic paradoxes you would like to explore in future episodes. See you next time on our channel.
Imagine Chicago, the 1920s. A guy from a poor Italian family transforms into one of the richest men in America in just a few years. His annual income reaches $100 million. That's more than $2 billion in today's money. He lives in luxury hotels, drives armored cars, and even the government can't stop him. His name is Alfonso Capone, but the whole world knows him as Al Capone. And the most amazing thing, he built all this wealth on selling something that was prohibited by law: unordinary alcohol. But here's what's really interesting. Capone wasn't a criminal genius from birth. He didn't invent smuggling. He didn't create organized crime. Thousands of people were doing the same thing during Prohibition. So why did he become a legend? Why did his empire grow to such proportions? The answer doesn't lie in violence or luck. The answer lies in the financial schemes he used, in business strategies that were brilliant even by the standards of legitimate business. Today we'll break down how Al Capone's financial machine worked, what tricks he used to turn illegal alcohol trade into a multi-million-dollar empire, and most importantly, why these methods were so effective that it took the government years just to understand how it all worked. We're not going to romanticize crime. We're simply going to look at the cold numbers and schemes that turned a street thug into a financial magnate. So, let's start from the very beginning. When Prohibition came into effect in America in 1920, most people thought it was a temporary inconvenience. The government banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Bars closed, breweries shut down, distilleries stopped operating. It seemed that an entire industry died overnight. But in reality, something completely different happened. The demand didn't disappear. People didn't stop wanting to drink. And that's where things get interesting. Imagine a market where demand remained the same, but legal supply dropped to zero. What happens to prices? Right, they skyrocket. Before Prohibition, a bottle of whiskey cost about $1. After the ban, the same bottle sold for $5, $10, or even $15, a markup of 10 to 15 times. That's the kind of money we're talking about. But Capone understood something that many of his competitors missed. It wasn't just about high prices. It was about controlling the entire supply chain. Most bootleggers of that time worked primitively. They bought alcohol somewhere in Canada or from local moonshiners, brought it into the city, and sold it in underground bars. Simple scheme: buy cheap, sell expensive. But Capone built something different. He created a vertically integrated corporation that controlled every stage, from production to sale to the end consumer. And this was his first brilliant financial trick. Let's look at how this worked in practice. Capone didn't just buy alcohol from suppliers. He owned his own breweries and distilleries. This gave him complete control over costs. While his competitors were paying middlemen, he was producing drinks himself. Then he organized his own transportation network. Trucks, warehouses, security, everything was his. This meant he didn't depend on outside transportation companies and their rates. And finally, he owned a network of sales points, underground bars called speakeasies. Here's a concrete example. Producing a gallon of beer cost Capone about 50 cents. The wholesale price for an independent bar would be $3 to $4 per gallon. But Capone sold beer in his own establishments for $15 to $20 per gallon, poured by the mug, a markup of 40 times, and all this money stayed within his organization. Each stage of the chain brought profit, and this profit didn't leak to middlemen. This is a classic business strategy that the largest corporations use today. Vertical integration. Control over the entire value creation chain. But in the conditions of an illegal market, this strategy had an additional advantage. Every middleman in the chain is a potential point of failure. It's a person who could turn you into the police. The fewer outside people in your business, the fewer risks. Capone simultaneously maximized profit and minimized risks. This was economics and security in one package. Now you understand the first key principle of his success. Control over the supply chain gave him a huge financial advantage over competitors, but vertical integration is just the beginning. Because Capone faced a problem that any large business faces, legal or not. How to manage money, how to hide income, and how to turn mountains of cash into legitimate wealth. We'll talk about that next. So Capone has a huge money-making machine. Every week his organization receives hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, mostly small bills. Imagine this problem. You have a room stuffed with money and you can't just go and deposit it in a bank. If you come to a bank with a suitcase full of cash, questions will immediately start. Where's the money from? What business? Did you pay taxes? In the 1920s, banks weren't yet required to report to authorities as thoroughly as now, but even then, large cash operations attracted attention. Capone needed to solve 3 tasks simultaneously. First, where to put the cash. Second, how to give his wealth an appearance of legality. Third, how to protect assets from confiscation if the authorities finally got to him. And here begins the second block of our story. The brilliant money laundering system through legitimate business. a system that became a model for criminal organizations for decades to come. The basic idea was simple. You need a legitimate business that works mainly with cash, a business where it's difficult to verify the real number of customers and real revenue. And Capone found the perfect solution: laundromats. Yes, ordinary self-service laundromats. In those days, this was a new, growing business. People came in, paid cash, washed their clothes, and left. No receipts, no records. Who can say how many customers really visited the laundromat in a day? 10 or 100? The scheme worked like this. Capone bought or opened laundromats all over Chicago. These establishments actually worked and served real customers. But in the financial reports, the number of customers and revenue were greatly inflated. A real laundromat brought in, say, $100 a day. But in the accounting books, they recorded $500. The difference of $400. This was money from alcohol sales, which now looked like legitimate income from washing clothes. This is where the term money laundering came from, by the way. Money was literally laundered through laundromats. But Capone went further. He understood that laundromats alone weren't enough. He needed a whole network of different legitimate businesses, and he started buying and opening everything: furniture stores, car washes, pawn shops, bookmaking offices, hotels, restaurants. At the peak of his power, Capone's organization controlled hundreds of legitimate enterprises, and each of them served as a channel for laundering dirty money. Let's take a concrete example. One of Capone's most famous businesses, the Metropole Hotel in Chicago. This was a real operating hotel. Real guests stayed there. But the hotel was also used for money laundering. How? Very simple. Non-existent guests were recorded in the registration books. The room is supposedly occupied, the client pays cash, the money goes into the hotel's revenue. In reality, this was money from bootlegging. But on paper, everything looked clean. Legitimate business, legitimate income, taxes paid. And here's the key point. Capone actually paid taxes on his legitimate businesses. Not all of them, of course, but enough not to attract attention. He understood that the government wouldn't dig too deep if they saw you were paying at least some taxes. Small underpayments were normal for that time. Many legitimate businessmen underpaid taxes. As long as you're paying something, you're not first on the list for audit. This was another financial trick. Create an appearance of law-abidingness. Now, imagine the whole picture. Capone has an illegal business producing and selling alcohol. This business brings huge profits in cash. This money is pumped through dozens of legitimate enterprises where it mixes with legitimate revenue. Part of the money goes to paying taxes, which creates an appearance of legality. And at the end, Capone receives clean, legitimate money that he can freely use. Buy real estate, invest, put in the bank. Everything looks completely legal. But that's not all. Capone added another level of protection. Most of his businesses weren't registered in his name personally. He used front men. Formally, the owners of laundromats, hotels, and stores were some people from his organization, relatives, partners. Capone himself officially didn't appear anywhere as an owner. This is called using nominees or shell directors. Why is this needed? To protect assets. If the authorities come to arrest Capone and want to confiscate his property, they'll face a problem. On paper, he has almost nothing. Everything belongs to other people. Here's a concrete case that shows how effective this was. When federal agents began a serious investigation against Capone, they tried to compile a list of his assets. And you know what? They found almost nothing. Formally, only one major property was registered in Al Capone's name, his mansion in Miami. Everything else belonged to other people. Agents knew that Capone controlled hundreds of businesses, but proving it was almost impossible. Money flowed through such a complex network of companies and frontmen that untangling it was extremely difficult. Let's draw an intermediate conclusion. Capone created a system that performed several functions simultaneously. It laundered dirty money, turning it into legitimate income. It created an appearance of law-abidingness through paying taxes. It protected assets by hiding real ownership of businesses. And all this worked like a well-oiled mechanism. Hundreds of people in his organization knew their role. Accountants kept double books, managers ran legitimate businesses, front owners signed documents. This was a real corporation, just illegal. But even the most clever financial scheme is useless if you don't have control over territory. If other gangs can come and take your business, if the police can shut down your establishments at any moment, and here we move to the third block of our story. How Capone used money to buy power and influence. Because the real secret of his success wasn't just in the ability to make money, but in the ability to spend it the right way. In the world of illegal business, there's one big problem. You can't go to court if someone violated a contract. You can't call the police if someone stole your goods. The law doesn't protect illegal business. Therefore, criminal organizations create their own methods of protection. Usually, it's violence. You threaten, intimidate, kill competitors and violators. This works, but it's expensive and dangerous. Every act of violence attracts police attention. Every war between gangs gives authorities a reason for harsh actions. Capone used violence, let's not deny that. His organization was brutal. But his real genius showed in something else. He understood that violence is an extreme measure. It's much more effective to buy the system from within, turn potential enemies into allies, and he began a systematic campaign to corrupt authorities. He bribed police officers, judges, politicians, officials. He spent huge money on bribes and kickbacks. And these weren't random bribes. This was a thought-out system. Let's look at how this worked at the lower level. An ordinary police patrol in Chicago earned about $3,000 a year. This was a modest salary even by 20s standards. Now imagine that a person from Capone's organization approaches this policeman and offers an additional $200 a month just for warning about raids, or accidentally not noticing a truck with alcohol, or responding slowly to a call about an underground bar. $200 a month, that's almost doubling the salary. Many agreed, but Capone didn't limit himself to individual policemen. He worked with entire precincts. There's documentary evidence that some police precincts in Chicago received regular payments from Capone's organization, and not individual officers received them, but the entire precinct collectively. The money was divided among everyone, from the janitor to the captain. This created a circle of mutual responsibility. If the entire precinct is on Capone's payroll, no one will snitch, because it means losing money for everyone. But even this was only the beginning. Capone moved higher up the hierarchy of power. He bribed politicians. In those times in America, corruption was common, especially in big cities. Political machines controlled elections, and this required money, lots of money, for election campaigns, for bribing voters, for organizing rallies, and Capone generously financed the right candidates. He didn't directly ask them to cover his business. He just helped them win elections. And then these politicians owed him. Here's a concrete example. The mayor of Chicago in the 1920s, William Thompson, was known for his connections with organized crime. There's evidence that Capone actively financed his election campaign. How much money exactly was transferred is unknown, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what was the result? During Thompson's rule, Chicago police practically didn't touch Capone's business. Raids were conducted rarely and usually on competitors' properties. Capone's underground bars operated almost openly. This was protection at the highest level. But corruption isn't just bribes with money. Capone also used other methods of influence. He created the appearance of a legitimate businessman and philanthropist. During the Great Depression, he opened free soup kitchens for the poor. Thousands of people received free food thanks to Capone. Newspapers wrote about his charity. Ordinary people considered him their benefactor. This created popular support. And this support was a form of protection. It was harder for politicians to persecute someone the people considered a hero. Now, imagine the full picture. Capone has a powerful economic machine that produces huge money. This money is laundered through legitimate businesses. Part of the money goes to bribing authorities at all levels, from patrolmen to politicians. Part goes to charity, which creates a positive image. As a result, Capone gets practically complete immunity. He can conduct his business almost openly. His establishments work, his trucks transport alcohol, and nobody touches him. This isn't just a criminal organization. This is parallel power. And here's an important financial principle. Capone spent huge money on corruption. According to some estimates, up to 30% of his income went to bribes and kickbacks. That's millions of dollars annually. But these weren't expenses. These were investments. Every bribed policeman, every bought politician, this was protection for the entire business. And this protection paid off 100-fold. Because while the authorities don't touch your business, you can work calmly and earn. Compare this with Capone's competitors. Many gangs spent money on weapons, on thugs, on wars with other groups. These were also big expenses, but they didn't create long-term protection. Killing a competitor is a solution for one day. Tomorrow someone else will come. But buying a police precinct or a politician is protection for years. Capone understood this earlier than others. He wasn't just building a gang. He was building a system that was integrated into the city's power structures. But this strategy had one problem. It only worked at the local level. Capone could control Chicago. He could bribe local police and local politicians. But he couldn't control the federal government. And when the feds finally decided to seriously deal with him, his entire protection system cracked. Because federal agents didn't report to local authorities, they couldn't be bought so easily. And they were looking for a way to get Capone where he was most vulnerable. So we've come to the final part. We've analyzed 3 main financial strategies of Capone: vertical integration of the entire chain of alcohol production and sales, a money laundering system through a network of legitimate businesses, and buying power through massive corruption. Each of these strategies was brilliant in itself. But together, they created an almost invulnerable empire. Capone earned huge money, legalized it, and protected his business from competitors and authorities. But every system has a weak point, and Capone's weak point turned out to be precisely money. The irony of fate, a man who built a brilliant financial empire was ultimately caught precisely on finances, because despite all his cleverness, he made one critical mistake. He underestimated accountants and tax collectors. In the late 1920s, the federal government realized that catching Capone for illegal alcohol trade was practically impossible. The protection system was too well built. Witnesses were afraid to talk. Evidence disappeared. Cases fell apart in court. But there was one person who proposed a different approach. His name was Eliot Ness, and he led a special group of federal agents called the Untouchables. Ness understood that Capone needed to be fought not as a gangster, but as a tax evader. And then real financial detective work began. Agents started collecting documents. They studied bank records. They interviewed employees of Capone's legitimate businesses. They checked accounts, receipts, payment slips. They reconstructed financial flows piece by piece. And gradually, the picture began to clear. Capone lived like a millionaire. He spent huge money on luxury, but at the same time, he paid almost no income taxes. In tax returns, Capone indicated minimal amounts or didn't file returns at all. And this was his mistake. Let's look at the numbers. In 1924, Capone didn't file a tax return at all. In 25, he indicated an income of $5,000. In 26, zero again. And during this time, he was buying real estate, expensive cars, clothing for thousands of dollars. He lived in luxury hotels and spent money left and right. Federal agents began collecting evidence of his real expenses. And it turned out that Capone spent several $1 million over 6 years without paying a cent in taxes on them. In 1931, Capone was charged with tax evasion, not for alcohol trade, not for murders, not for extortion, for taxes. And it worked, because proving tax evasion turned out to be much easier than proving his involvement in crimes. No witnesses were needed who could be intimidated. Accounting documents were enough. Numbers don't lie. And the numbers clearly showed. Capone received huge income and didn't pay taxes. Capone's trial was a sensation. The prosecution presented mountains of documents. They showed that Capone should have paid more than $200,000 in taxes. This was a huge amount for those times. The defense tried to prove that the government couldn't accurately establish the sources of Capone's income, but the prosecution didn't need that. It was enough for them to prove the very fact of income and non-payment of taxes. The source doesn't matter. Even if you earned money criminally, you're obligated to pay taxes on it. Such is the paradox of American legislation. In October 1931, the jury found Capone guilty on several counts of tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in prison and a fine of $50,000 plus all unpaid taxes. This was the maximum possible sentence for those charges. Capone's empire collapsed, not from competitors' bullets, not from police raids, but from tax collectors' accounting calculations. The man who created a brilliant money laundering system couldn't properly fill out tax returns. What conclusions can we draw from Al Capone's story? The first and most important: financial literacy is more important than force. Capone became a legend not because he was the most brutal. There were more brutal gangsters. He became a legend because he understood how money works, how to build business structures, how to manage financial flows, how to protect assets. His organization was essentially a corporation, just illegal. And that's what made it so powerful and durable. Second conclusion: any business, legal or not, is built on the same principles: cost control, vertical integration to reduce dependence on suppliers, risk diversification through many different assets, investments in business protection. All these principles work equally whether in a legal corporation or a criminal organization. Capone applied methods that are described today in any business administration textbook. Third conclusion: laundering money through legitimate business isn't just a way to hide income. It's a way of integrating into the economy. Capone understood that you can't build a long-term empire only on a legal business. You need a legal facade. You need legal assets. You need an appearance of law-abidingness. And his network of laundromats, hotels, stores created exactly that. He was becoming part of the legal economy, which gave him additional protection and respect. Fourth conclusion: corruption can be an effective business strategy, but only up to a certain limit. Capone was able to buy local power. He controlled Chicago police and local politicians. But he couldn't buy the federal government. When the Fed seriously took him on, his entire protection system proved useless. This shows the limitations of a corruption strategy. It works locally, but not globally. Fifth, and perhaps the most ironic conclusion: any system is vulnerable in details. Capone built an incredibly complex and thought-out financial empire. But he missed one small detail: tax returns. He thought that if he hid the sources of income, tax collectors wouldn't be able to get to him. But American tax legislation doesn't require proving the source of income. It's enough to prove the very fact of income and non-payment of taxes. This small legal nuance destroyed his entire empire. Another important lesson: the appearance of legality is important, but insufficient. Capone created the image of a law-abiding businessman. He paid part of his taxes, he engaged in charity, he gave interviews in which he presented himself as an ordinary entrepreneur. But this turned out to be insufficient because the numbers said otherwise. His expenses far exceeded his declared income, and no matter how much he portrayed law-abidingness, mathematics was against him. Let's also talk about the scale of his operations. At the peak of his power, Capone's organization controlled about 1,000 employees. He had a clear hierarchy. He divided Chicago into districts, each had its own manager. He had specialists in different areas: production, transportation, sales, security, finance, relations with authorities. This was a real corporate structure, and it was precisely this organization that allowed him to manage such a huge volume of operations. It's also interesting to look at what happened after Capone's arrest. His organization didn't disappear immediately. For some time it continued to work under the leadership of other people, but without Capone, it began to fall apart. Why? Because he wasn't just a boss, he was a system-forming element. He built connections, negotiated, planned strategy. His successors were good executors, but they lacked his financial mind and strategic thinking. This shows how important the leader's role is in any organization. There's another aspect that's important to mention. Capone became possible thanks to prohibition. This was a law that contradicted the desires of millions of people. People wanted to drink alcohol, but the law forbade it. And this created a huge black market. Capone simply filled the void created by a stupid law. This is a lesson for lawmakers. Prohibitions that don't take reality into account create crime, not eradicate it. When prohibition was repealed in 1933, the illegal alcohol industry began to die. Capone was already in prison by then, but even if he had been free, his business model would have stopped working. Legal companies returned to the market, prices fell, the super profits that made bootlegging so attractive disappeared. Many former bootleggers left the business or switched to other illegal goods, drugs, gambling, prostitution. And what happened to Capone himself? He served 8 years out of 11 and was released in 1939. But this was no longer the same Capone. In prison, he contracted third-stage syphilis, which affected his brain. He spent his last years in his Miami mansion practically incapacitated. His financial empire had crumbled by then. Money went to fines, legal costs, supporting his family. The man who once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars died in 1947, leaving a relatively modest estate. Another lesson. Criminal money rarely brings long-term prosperity, but Capone's influence on organized crime remained forever. His methods, vertical integration, laundering through legitimate business, systemic corruption, became the standard for all major criminal organizations. The Italian mafia, Mexican cartels, Russian organized groups, they all use in one form or another the principles that Capone developed. He didn't invent organized crime, but he turned it into real business with clear structure and financial discipline. There's another interesting point. Capone was one of the first who understood the power of publicity. He didn't hide from the press. On the contrary, he gave interviews, was photographed, created his public image. He understood that fame is also a form of protection. The more public you are, the harder it is to quietly eliminate you. And the more people know and support you, the more political costs authorities have from your persecution. This strategy was later used by many criminals and even quite legal businessmen. Now let's talk about what this story means for us today. The world has changed. Prohibition is gone. Technologies for controlling finances have become much more advanced. Banks are required to report suspicious operations. Tax services have access to huge data arrays. Laundering money through a simple laundromat is almost impossible today. Tracking systems have become too good, but the principles that Capone used haven't gone anywhere. Vertical integration still remains a powerful business strategy. The world's largest corporations strive to control the entire chain from production to sales. Apple controls hardware, software, and retail stores. Amazon controls warehouses, logistics, sales platform. This is the same principle that Capone used, just in legal format. Money laundering also hasn't gone anywhere. Methods have just become more complex. Now offshore companies are used, complex schemes with multiple jurisdictions, cryptocurrencies, fictitious trade operations, but the essence is the same. Take illegal money and give it an appearance of legality. Tax authorities around the world fight this but can't completely win because financial schemes constantly evolve. Corruption also remains a reality in many countries. Methods have become more veiled. Now it's not just envelopes with money. It's consulting contracts, charitable foundations, services to relatives, positions after leaving politics. But the principle is the same. Use money to buy influence and protection. And this still works, especially in countries with weak institutions. What can we take from Capone's story as ordinary people who aren't planning to engage in crime? First, understanding how money and financial systems work. Capone was financially literate. He understood value creation chains, markups, costs, risks. This knowledge is useful in any business. Second, the importance of proper documentation and reporting. Capone got caught precisely on neglecting paperwork. In legitimate business, proper record-keeping and paying taxes isn't just a formality, it's protection from problems. Third, understanding that any system has weak points. Capone built strong protection from local authorities, but didn't account for the federal level. In business, it's also important to look at the whole picture and not miss weak links. Fourth, the importance of reputation and public image. Capone understood the power of publicity. In the modern world, reputation is expensive. Companies spend huge money on PR and reputation management. This isn't foolishness. This is a real business asset. And finally, Capone's story shows that short-term success doesn't guarantee long-term prosperity. He was at the top for less than 10 years. Then, prison, illness, oblivion. Building something truly solid is only possible on a legal basis. Criminal money comes quickly, but leaves even faster, and rarely brings happiness. Capone earned hundreds of millions. But what did he get in the end? A few years of luxury, then prison and decrepitude. Not the best life. So what can we say in conclusion? Al Capone was a financial genius who applied his talents in the criminal sphere. His methods were so effective that they're still studied and copied today. He showed that organized crime can work like a real corporation with clear structure, financial discipline, and long-term strategy. But he also showed the limitations of the criminal path. You can earn huge money illegally, but you can't keep it for long. The system gets you sooner or later. His story is both a lesson and a warning. The lesson is that financial literacy and strategic thinking can create an empire from nothing. The warning is that an empire built on the sand of illegality will inevitably collapse. It's just a matter of time. Capone was smarter, more cunning, and more organized than most of his competitors. But even he couldn't deceive the system forever. If you're interested in the topic of financial schemes and how money works in legal and illegal business, I recommend studying this topic more deeply. Read books on the history of organized crime. Study how modern money laundering methods work and how they're fought against. Understand your country's tax legislation. Learn the basics of corporate structures and financial accounting. All this is knowledge that will be useful in legitimate business. The main thing, remember that financial literacy is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for creation or destruction. Capone chose destruction and ultimately destroyed himself. You can choose creation and build something truly valuable and durable. The principles of how money works are the same for a criminal as for a legitimate entrepreneur. But the consequences are completely different. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories about how money and financial systems work. Give it a like if it was interesting. Write in the comments about what other historical figures and their financial schemes you'd like to hear about. Maybe the Medici and their banking empire, or John Rockefeller and creating an oil monopoly, or modern oligarchs and their methods. Share your thoughts. See you in the next videos. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to money.
We've been sold a lie, a comforting myth repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and even financial advice columns. That empires fall because of moral decay, barbarian hordes, or military overreach. But what if the real killer was something far more insidious? Something hiding in plain sight. In the ledgers, the coinage, the very money that fueled their conquests? What if the true story of Rome's collapse wasn't written in blood on the battlefield, but in ink on balance sheets? And what if the exact same financial disease that consumed the greatest empire the world had ever seen is quietly infecting our own economic system right now? Today, we're not just going to uncover how ancient Rome paid for its legions, its roads, its bread, and its circuses. We're going to dissect the financial engine that powered its rise, and the catastrophic, self-inflicted wound that doomed it. And then, we'll look in the mirror because the parallels between Rome's fiscal choices and our modern monetary policies aren't just eerie, they're shocking, and they hold profound, urgent lessons for your savings, your investments, and your financial future. This isn't just history. It's a warning etched in gold and debased silver. To understand Rome's financial collapse, we must first understand its astonishing success. For centuries, Rome wasn't just a city-state. It was a remarkably efficient financial machine. Its early system was built on three pillars: sound money, prudent taxation, and ruthless booty. Rome's first coins weren't fancy. They started with heavy bronze bars, as rude, then standardized bronze ingots, as signatum. But the real game-changer came around 211 BC, the silver denarius. This wasn't just currency, it was a promise of consistent weight, about 5 grams, and high purity, nearly 95 to 98% silver. This trust in the coin's intrinsic value was the bedrock of Roman commerce and military pay. Soldiers knew their denarii were worth real silver. Merchants trusted them across the Mediterranean. Taxation was surprisingly light, at least initially. Roman citizens paid minimal direct taxes. The state's primary revenue streams were ingenious: tribute from allies and conquered territories. As Rome expanded in Italy, defeated cities and tribes paid annual tributes, often in grain, raw materials, or coin. This was externalized cost. Customs duties, portoria. Taxes on goods moving through Roman ports and across provincial borders. A steady, low-friction stream. State monopolies and leases. Rome leased out rights to collect taxes in provinces, publicani, and managed lucrative state assets like mines and salt pans. But the real fuel for early expansion? Booty. Pure, unadulterated plunder. Every successful campaign wasn't just a military victory, it was a massive, immediate cash injection. Think of the sack of Syracuse in 212 BC during the Second Punic War. The loot filled the Roman treasury, aerarium, to overflowing. Gold, silver, artwork, slaves. This wasn't just wealth, it was risk-free capital. No taxes raised, no debt incurred. Just take it. This system worked brilliantly for centuries. Sound money fostered trade and trust. Light domestic taxation kept citizens content. External tribute and customs provided steady income. And the prospect of massive, war-fueled windfalls incentivized relentless expansion. Rome wasn't just conquering land, it was conquering revenue streams. The financial engine was purring, but engines under constant, extreme stress eventually crack. And Rome's stress was about to become unbearable. The Punic Wars against Carthage changed everything. These weren't border skirmishes. They were existential. Total wars spanning decades and continents. Building and maintaining massive fleets, paying legions for years on end, far from home, supplying sieges. The costs were astronomical. Booty was still crucial. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC yielded a staggering 500,000 denarii per day for the treasury for months, but it became increasingly unreliable. What if a war dragged on? What if the enemy had little portable wealth? What if you lost? Rome faced its first major fiscal crisis. The old model was breaking. They needed predictable, massive, sustained funding. Their solution? Debt and debasement, the first tremors of the coming earthquake. Massive public debt. Finance. The state began borrowing heavily from wealthy citizens and temples. Interest rates soared. While Rome usually repaid, often with future booty, this created a powerful class of creditors with a vested interest in more war to ensure repayment. War became not just a policy, but a financial necessity. The first debasements, subtle at first. Facing coin shortages during the Second Punic War, Rome slightly reduced the silver content of the denarius and introduced lower-value bronze coins, sestertii asses, more aggressively. It was a small tweak, but it broke the sacred promise of the coin's intrinsic value. Trust, once eroded, is hard to rebuild. Provincial exploitation intensifies. With Italy largely pacified, the burden shifted entirely to the provinces. Tax farming, publicani, became notoriously brutal. Governors like Verres in Sicily, prosecuted by Cicero, extorted provinces mercilessly, not just for Rome, but for their own enrichment. This bred deep resentment, sowed the seeds of rebellion, and ultimately reduced long-term revenue as economies were crippled. The engine was now running hot, fueled by debt and the slow poisoning of its own currency. But the real crisis was still ahead. The Republic's political system, designed for a city-state, couldn't handle the stresses of a global empire. Ambitious generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and finally Julius Caesar realized something terrifying. The legion's loyalty was shifting from the Senate and people of Rome to the general who paid them. And who paid them? Often, the general himself, using his personal wealth plundered from campaigns. Soldiers expected land grants or cash bonuses, donativa, upon discharge, promises the bankrupt state couldn't always fulfill. The military, the very instrument of Roman power, was becoming a private army for sale to the highest bidder. The financial instability was now directly fueling political instability. The stage was set for civil war and a desperate search for a new financial savior. Enter Augustus. The victor of Actium didn't just found the empire. He performed radical fiscal surgery. He understood the core problem. The Republic's chaotic ad hoc system couldn't fund a standing army of 300,000 men guarding 7,000 miles of frontier indefinitely. His solution was masterful and ultimately unsustainable. Augustus centralized everything. He created the imperial treasury, fiscus, separate from the old republican treasury, aerarium, giving the emperor direct control over the empire's main revenue streams. He professionalized tax collection, reducing, but not eliminating, the worst abuses of the publicani. He established a permanent military treasury, aerarium militare, funded by new, dedicated taxes, a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax across the empire. Most crucially, he used his personal wealth, the vast estates of Egypt, his share of war booty, to subsidize the state, creating an illusion of solvency. For nearly 2 centuries, the era of the 5 good emperors, this system worked. The Pax Romana flourished. Trade boomed. The denarius, while occasionally tweaked, remained relatively stable. Rome seemed financially invincible, but this stability was a mirage built on 3 dangerous foundations. The Egyptian lifeline. Egypt wasn't just a province, it was the emperor's personal cash cow. Its incredibly efficient grain production and tax collection poured vast, reliable wealth directly into the fiscus. This masked underlying weaknesses in the rest of the empire's finances. The booty buffer. While large-scale conquests slowed, emperors like Trajan still launched major wars, Dacia, Parthia, specifically for the massive plunder they yielded. Trajan's Dacian Wars, Comum 106 AD, flooded Rome with an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and 1,000 pounds of silver, enough to fund the state for decades. This created a dangerous addiction. The empire needed periodic, massive windfalls to stay afloat. The hidden cost of peace. Maintaining the Pax Romana wasn't free. The standing army was colossal. The grain dole, annona, for Rome's million-plus citizens, was a massive, non-negotiable expense. Grand public works, aqueducts, baths, roads, were essential for stability, but incredibly costly. The system was optimized for steady state, not crisis. The engine was running smoothly, but it was running flat out, with no reserve capacity. It was utterly dependent on continued peace, continued Egyptian revenue, and the memory of past plunder. It had no shock absorbers. And then, the shocks came. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD wasn't just the end of a philosopher king, it was the end of an era of relative stability. The perfect storm hit. The Antonine Plague, 180 AD, killed an estimated 10–20% of the empire's population, devastating the tax base and the army's manpower. Resurgent barbarian threats, massive invasions across the Rhine and Danube frontiers required constant, expensive military responses. The end of easy plunder. No more Trajanic windfalls. Wars were now purely defensive, consuming wealth, not generating it. Political instability, the crisis of the 3rd century, saw 26 emperors in 50 years, most assassinated by their own troops. Legions demanded ever larger donativa just to proclaim a new emperor. Faced with collapsing revenue and exploding costs, the emperors reached for the only tool left: currency debasement. Not the subtle tweaks of the Republic, but a full-blown, desperate assault on the currency itself. Septimius Severus, 193–211 AD. To pay his troops after a civil war, he slashed the denarius's silver content from about 70% to 50%. He famously advised his sons on his deathbed: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. The financial priority was clear: buy military loyalty at any cost. The downward spiral, each successor facing the same pressures: barbarian invasions, plague, civil war, mutinous legions, debased the coinage further. By the mid-3rd century, the silver denarius was mostly copper with a thin silver wash. The Antoninianus, introduced as a double denarius, was even worse. The death of trust. People knew. Merchants refused the new coins or demanded vastly more of them. Barter became common. Prices, quoted in the old trusted denarius, skyrocketed. Hyperinflation took hold. Diocletian's infamous Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 AD, which tried to cap thousands of prices by law, was a spectacular, unenforceable failure, proving the currency was utterly worthless. The financial system didn't just malfunction, it imploded. The state could no longer pay its soldiers reliably in real value. Loyalty evaporated. Provinces, starved of central support and burdened by impossible tax demands, often paid in kind, grain, cloth, labor, because money was useless, began to fragment. The empire wasn't just militarily weak, it was financially hollowed out. The engine had seized, choked on its own poisoned fuel. The breaking point wasn't a single battle. It was the moment the last citizen refused to accept the emperor's coin. This isn't just dusty history. Look at your wallet. Look at your investment portfolio. Look at the economic headlines screaming at you every day. The Roman playbook is being followed, step by step, in the 21st century. The engine of debt. Rome turned to debt when booty ran out. Today, the U.S. national debt has exploded from $7 trillion in 2001 to over $34 trillion today. Global debt stands at a staggering $307 trillion, IIF 2023. Like Rome relying on Egyptian grain, we rely on the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency to keep borrowing cheaply. For now. But what happens when that trust erodes? The modern debasement. Rome debased its silver coins. We debased our fiat currency, paper and digital promises, backed by nothing but trust in the government. Since the U.S. abandoned the gold standard in 1971, the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power, BLS data. The great moderation of low inflation masked the underlying money printing, but the 2020-2023 surge, peaking at 1% in the US, was a stark reminder. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Milton Friedman. It's the modern equivalent of the silver wash wearing off the denarius. The military-industrial complex is the new legions. Rome's army demanded donativa. Today, the U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. CPRI 2023. This isn't just defense. It's a vast economic engine, employing millions and consuming trillions. Like the Roman legions, it creates powerful constituencies with a vested interest in sustained high spending, a modern form of political capture driven by fiscal necessity. Cutting it is politically perilous, just as reducing legion pay was for Roman emperors. The illusion of stability. Augustus used Egyptian wealth to mask systemic weakness. Today, quantitative easing, QE, central banks creating trillions of dollars to buy government bonds, has artificially suppressed interest rates and inflated asset prices, stocks, real estate, for over a decade. This created an illusion of prosperity, masking underlying debt burdens and productivity issues, much like Trajan's Dacian gold masked Rome's structural fiscal problems. The 2022 market crash was a taste of what happens when that illusion fades. The parallels aren't coincidental. They stem from the same fundamental truth. Unsustainable fiscal policies, driven by the need to fund massive state obligations, especially military, without commensurate revenue, inevitably lead to currency debasement and loss of trust. Rome had silver. We have digits on a screen. The mechanism is different, but the economic law is identical. And the consequence, the erosion of savings and the distortion of the entire economy, is just as real for you today as it was for a Roman merchant 1,800 years ago. So, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we protect ourselves from the modern echoes of Rome's fiscal collapse? Here are 3 actionable takeaways, forged in the fires of history. Distrust the sound of fiat money. Seek real assets. Rome's citizens learned too late that the appearance of silver wasn't the same as its substance. Don't make the same mistake with paper promises. Allocate a portion of your portfolio to assets with intrinsic value that have survived monetary collapses for millennia. Gold and silver, not as speculative gambles, but as insurance, a non-correlated store of value when fiat trust falters. Rome's elite hoarded gold solidi even as the denarius died. Productive real assets, farmland, timberland, essential infrastructure. These generate real goods and services, independent of currency fluctuations. They are the modern equivalent of owning the land that produces the grain Rome needed. Strong, cash-flowing businesses, companies with pricing power, essential products, and low debt can navigate inflation better than most. They represent real economic output, not just financial engineering. Beware the siren song of easy money and artificial stability. Augustus's Egyptian subsidy and Trajan's Dacian gold created dangerous complacency. Today's ultra-low interest rates and perpetual QE have done the same, inflating bubbles and encouraging reckless debt. Be skeptical of "this time is different" narratives. When asset prices seem detached from underlying fundamentals, like Roman real estate prices during the debasement, it's time for caution, not FOMO. Focus on value and resilience, not just momentum. Your greatest asset is your ability to adapt and produce value. In Rome's final chaotic centuries, the people who survived weren't just those hoarding gold, but those who could produce something essential: food, security, skilled labor, often in localized, self-sufficient communities. Invest relentlessly in your own human capital. Skills. Develop abilities that are in demand regardless of the macro environment. trades, critical thinking, problem solving, care work. Networks. Build strong, trustworthy relationships. In times of systemic stress, community and mutual aid become paramount. Financial literacy. Understand how money works, how inflation erodes wealth, and how governments finance themselves. Knowledge is your first line of defense. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't fall because of one bad emperor or one lost battle. It fell because, over centuries, it made a series of seemingly small, pragmatic financial choices, debasing a little here, borrowing a bit more there, shifting the burden onto the provinces, that cumulatively destroyed the foundation of trust upon which its entire economy, and ultimately its civilization, was built. The warning isn't that we will collapse like Rome. Civilizations are complex, and we have tools they lacked. The warning is that the mechanism of financial decay is universal. Ignoring the long-term consequences of debt, debasement, and the prioritization of short-term political expediency, buying loyalty, avoiding hard choices, over sustainable fiscal health, is a path that always leads to erosion of wealth and loss of freedom. Your portfolio isn't just numbers on a screen. It's your claim on future resources, your security, your ability to live the life you choose. The story of Rome's finances is a stark reminder. No currency, no government promise, no financial system is immune to the laws of economics. Trust must be earned and maintained, not assumed. So, the question isn't just, what happened to Rome? The urgent question is, what am I doing today to ensure my financial resilience in a world repeating its oldest, most dangerous patterns? If this deep dive into the hidden financial forces that shaped history and are shaping your future resonated with you, please hit the like button. It tells YouTube this matters. Subscribe and tap the bell. We're just getting started on uncovering the financial secrets of empires, from the Medici banks to the Dutch tulip mania, and what they mean for you. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history isn't just about the past. It's the best guide we have to navigating the future. Drop a comment below. What historical financial crisis should we dissect next? The South Sea bubble? The Weimar hyperinflation? Let us know. And remember, stay curious, stay skeptical, and always protect your real wealth.
1989, Colombian mountains. A family hiding from authorities in a cold cabin. The daughter is shivering from the cold. There's no firewood, and then the father reaches into a bag and starts throwing stacks of bills into the fireplace. One stack, a second, a tenth. That night, $2 million burned, used as ordinary firewood. This isn't fiction. This is a real story from the memoirs of Pablo Escobar's son. And you know what's strangest? For Escobar, this was a rational decision because he had too much money. So much that it transformed from an asset into a problem, into a burden, into something that needed to be burned to warm a child. Today, we'll break down the most insane business model in human history. A model where profits were so enormous that money literally rotted in the ground. Where rats devoured millions of dollars and the owner didn't care. Where one person spent $2.5 billion a year just on bribes, and this was considered normal overhead. Get ready. Because the numbers you're about to hear will change your understanding of how money works. Let's start from the very beginning, with the basic mathematics of production. In the Colombian jungles of the early 80s, a farmer could grow the necessary raw materials practically for free. Seeds, land, water, sun. Minimal investment. After a few months, he harvested the leaves. A kilogram of leaves cost about $10. Just $10. These leaves went to underground laboratories in the jungle. There they were processed into paste, then into pure product. All the chemical processing cost approximately $1,000 per kilogram of finished product. Add packaging, transportation within Colombia, chemists' salaries. In the end, the cost of 1 kilogram came to about $1,500. Remember this figure. Now watch what happened to this kilogram next. Escobar transported the product to Miami or other U.S. cities. Transportation costs, planes, boats, bribing border guards, added another couple $1,000s per kilogram. Total, 1 kilogram in Miami cost the cartel approximately $4,000, all expenses included. And how much did this kilogram sell for? $60,000 wholesale. A markup of 15 times. 15 times. No legal business in the world generates such margins. Even luxury brands, even pharmaceuticals don't come close to these numbers. And if you consider that dealers then diluted the product and sold it to end consumers, the final street price reached $200,000 per kilogram. But wait, the story gets even more interesting because Escobar didn't sell by the kilogram. He sold by the ton. His organization produced and transported to the U.S. up to 15 tons every month. 15 tons. That's 15,000 kilograms. Multiply by $60,000 in pure profit from each kilogram. That's $900 million in pure profit every month. Almost $1 billion every month. Now, multiply by 12 months. That's almost $11 billion a year. And this is only Escobar's profit. The Medellin cartel controlled about 80% of what entered the U.S., but other groups worked there too. Escobar's total income by the most conservative estimates was $21 billion a year. In today's money, that's more than $60 billion annually. Imagine this, $60 billion every year. That's more than the GDP of some countries. That's more than the annual budget of half of Africa's nations. One person controlling a financial flow comparable to a national economy. And all this from a product whose cost is $1,500 per kilogram. But here's the thing. This enormous money created a problem that no ordinary businessman thinks about. The problem of the physical volume of cash. Because the product was sold for cash. No bank transfers, no checks, pure cash. And when you receive $1 billion in cash every month, mostly in small bills, you face a logistical nightmare. Let's look at the math. $1 million in $100 bills weighs about 10 kilograms. $1 billion, that's 10,000 kilograms. 10 tons of paper money. Every month Escobar received literally tons of cash, and most of it wasn't in hundreds, but in 20s and 10s. This increased the weight and volume several times. Imagine, rooms stuffed with bags of money, warehouses filled with stacks of bills, money everywhere. And here begins the craziest part of Escobar's story, because he had so much money that it became not an asset, but a burden. There's documented evidence that Escobar spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to tie stacks of money. $2,500 on rubber bands. Does this seem trivial? Against the backdrop of billions, yes, but this shows the scale of the problem. The amount of money was so enormous that even supplies for storing it cost thousands. But that's not the craziest part. Escobar had so much cash that he physically couldn't store it in safe places. Banks were out too many questions. Storing everything in one place too risky. So he scattered money across dozens of hiding places, buried it in the ground, hid it in walls of houses, stored it in secret warehouses. And here the losses began. There's testimony from Escobar's brother, Roberto, who managed the cartel's finances. He said they lost about 10% of cash every year simply due to spoilage. 10%. From $20 billion, that's $2 billion annually. $2 billion simply written off as inevitable losses. Why? Because money rotted from moisture. Rats ate it. Yes, rats literally gnawed on bills. Some hiding places were forgotten or their coordinates were lost. Part was confiscated by police during random discoveries. Think about this. $2 billion a year written off as operating losses. That's more than the profit of most Fortune 500 corporations. For Escobar, this was an expense item called natural shrinkage. He didn't even try to fix it, because profit was still so enormous that losing 10% didn't matter. It's like for an ordinary person losing 10 cents from $1. Unpleasant, but not critical. And now that famous story about Escobar's insane economics, a story that perfectly illustrates the absurdity of the situation. Once Escobar was hiding from authorities in the mountains with his family. It was cold, very cold. They didn't have firewood, and you know what Escobar did? He burned $2 million in cash to keep his daughter warm. $2 million used as firewood, because there was more money than firewood. This story is confirmed by his son Juan Pablo, who later changed his name to Sebastian Marroquin. He described this episode in his memoirs. His father burned approximately $2 million in one night so the family wouldn't freeze. For Escobar, this was a rational decision. Money was the least valuable resource at that moment. He had too much of it, and it was useless in the mountains. And warmth for his family was necessary. Perverted logic, but mathematically justified. Now let's talk about Escobar's second huge expense item, about corruption. Because his business model wasn't built just on production and sales, it was built on buying an entire state. Escobar didn't hide from authorities, he bought authorities, and this cost him astronomical sums. By various estimates, bribes to officials, police, judges, politicians, and military personnel consumed $2 to $3 billion annually. $3 billion on corruption. Every year. To understand the scale, let's break down how this worked. At the bottom level, ordinary police officers. Escobar paid an ordinary policeman in Medellin about $500 a month to turn a blind eye to his operations. With an average police salary of $200, this was more than double. Several thousand police officers on the payroll, that's already millions a month. Higher up were officers, precinct chiefs, regional commanders. Their price was higher tens of thousands a month each. Judges received even more hundreds of thousands for the right verdict or for delaying a case. Governors, senators, ministers, their price was measured in millions. Escobar offered the Colombian government to pay off the entire national debt of the country $10 billion in exchange for a guarantee of immunity. The government refused, but the very fact of such an offer shows the scale of his financial capabilities. But corruption for Escobar wasn't just an expense, it was an investment in business protection. Every bought policeman that's information about raids. Every bought judge that's a case falling apart in court. Every bought politician that's lobbying for needed laws. Escobar was building parallel power. He was creating a state within a state. And while his income measured in billions, spending $2 to $3 billion on corruption was a reasonable investment. Let's calculate the overall picture. Income $21 billion a year, minus $2 billion for natural money losses, minus $3 billion for corruption, minus about $1 billion for operating expenses, salaries for thousands of employees, transport, weapons, security, laboratories. That leaves approximately $15 billion in pure profit annually. $15 billion with nowhere to put it. And here, Escobar faced a problem that no other criminal in history had solved. What to do with this much money? He couldn't put it in a bank. Any large deposit would attract attention. He couldn't invest in business too actively. Where would someone in his position get legal capital? He couldn't spend on personal consumption. It's physically impossible to spend billions on yourself. So Escobar started doing what seems like madness from the standpoint of normal economics. He buried money in the ground, literally. Throughout Colombia, there were hiding places with cash, plastic barrels and containers filled with dollars, buried in jungles, on farms, in mountains. Billions of dollars just lying in the ground, not working, not bringing profit, just stored, slowly rotting from humidity and becoming food for rodents. By some estimates, after Escobar's death in 1993, hiding places remained in the ground totaling about $3 billion. $3 billion that were never found by his family or authorities. Just lost money. Coordinates forgotten, people who knew the location dead or silent. Somewhere in the Colombian jungles, Escobar's billions are still rotting. But not all money was buried. Part Escobar tried to legitimize through business. He bought real estate houses, ranches, land. He built an entire neighborhood in Medellin for the poor, gave away hundreds of houses for free. He built soccer fields, schools, hospitals. He became a folk hero for poor Colombians. This wasn't pure charity, it was buying popular support, and it worked. When police hunted him, thousands of people in Medellin slums protected him because he was their benefactor. Escobar also invested in legal business, restaurants, stores, taxis, construction companies. Essentially the same scheme Al Capone used, laundering money through legal business. But the scale was different. Capone controlled hundreds of businesses. Escobar owned thousands. Entire city districts worked for him. Officially, he was the owner of a modest taxi business. Unofficially, he controlled a significant part of Medellin's economy. Another expense item worth mentioning: violence. Escobar wasn't just a businessman, he was a terrorist. When corruption didn't work, he used fear. Judge won't take a bribe, eliminate his family. Politician speaks out for extradition, blow up his car. Policeman too honest? Remove him. Journalist writes exposés? Silence him. Escobar personally ordered thousands of killings, the most famous, the Avianca plane explosion in 1989. 110 people perished. The target was one presidential candidate. The candidate wasn't even on board, but Escobar still ordered the plane destroyed. This was a message. I can reach anyone, anywhere. The operation cost a few $1,000s for explosives and executors. The effect, a country paralyzed by fear. In total, on Escobar's and his cartel's account, more than 4,000 killings. This doesn't count victims of wars with competing cartels and victims among consumers. Violence was part of the business model. Expenses on hired killers, explosives, weapons, another few $100 million a year. But again, against the backdrop of income of $20 billion, these were acceptable costs. The price of doing business. Now, let's talk about the most interesting aspect of Escobar's economics, why his business model was practically invulnerable from a financial standpoint. Even when authorities confiscated tons of product, even when laboratories were destroyed, even when key people were arrested, the cartel continued working and bringing in billions. Why? The answer is in the mathematics of marginality. When your markup is 1,500%, you can afford to lose half the shipments and still remain profitable. Let's calculate. A kilogram costs $4,000, sells for $60,000, profit $56,000 per kilogram. Now let's imagine half the shipments are confiscated. That means from 2 kilograms on which $8,000 were spent, only one sells for $60,000. Profit $52,000, still enormous margin. This is precisely why fighting this trade is so difficult. Even massive confiscations don't critically affect cartel economics. Escobar planned for losses. He sent more to the U.S. than needed, knowing some would be intercepted. This was a cost built into the model, like taxes for legal business. Only instead of the tax office, it was losses from DEA and Coast Guard. Moreover, each large confiscation even worked for Escobar in a certain sense. When authorities seized several tons, supply in the market fell, prices rose. Those shipments that got through sold for more. The market self-regulated in favor of producers. This is the economics of scarcity. The harder it is to deliver goods, the higher the price. And while demand remained huge and legalization wasn't even discussed, prices stayed at astronomical levels. There's another aspect of Escobar's economics rarely discussed. The impact on Colombia's legal economy. Billions of dollars from his trade didn't remain in a vacuum. They poured into the Colombian economy. Construction, real estate, restaurants, stores, all this created jobs. Thousands of people indirectly depended on cartel money, even without participating in the trade directly. By some estimates, during the peak years of cartel activity, up to 10% of Colombia's GDP was somehow connected to this money. This created a paradoxical situation. On one hand, the cartels were destroying the country with violence and corruption. On the other, they were a significant economic factor. When Escobar was eliminated in 1993, Medellin's economy temporarily slumped. Thousands of people lost their source of income. This shows another side of prohibited goods economics. When a black market reaches such scales, it becomes part of the economic ecosystem. You can't just turn it off without consequences. It's like a tumor that has grown into healthy tissue. Removing it is difficult without damaging the entire organism. This is precisely why the fight against cartels proved so long and complex. Let's now talk about Escobar's fall and what this says about his business model. After many years of dominance, pressure from U.S. and Colombian governments gradually increased. Special units were created. Competitors entered the picture, especially the Cali cartel. Internal betrayals began. Escobar eliminated too many people, and even his allies began turning away from him. Eventually, in December 1993, a special police group tracked Escobar down in Medellin and shot him on a rooftop. He was 44 years old. During his life, he earned by various estimates from $30 to $50 billion. But what remained for his family? Practically nothing. Most assets were confiscated, frozen, or simply lost. His widow and children fled the country and lived modestly. This shows the fundamental weakness of Escobar's model. You can earn billions illegally, but you can't preserve them and pass them to the next generation. There's no legal protection, no guarantees. Anyone can take the money by force. The state confiscates everything it finds. Competitors eliminate you for market share. Accomplices betray you for rewards. Illegal money flows like water through fingers, comes quickly, leaves even faster. After Escobar's death, the Medellin cartel collapsed, but the trade didn't disappear. It was taken over by other organizations. The Cali cartel continued until it too was crushed. Then came Mexican cartels, then other groups. The business model remained, because the fundamental economics didn't change. Huge demand in the US and Europe, ban on production and sale, consequently astronomical prices and super profits for those willing to risk. What can we extract from Escobar's economics? First lesson: bans on goods with high demand create black markets with incredible profitability. When the state prohibits what millions of people want, it doesn't destroy demand. It simply hands the market to criminals and gives them the opportunity to set any prices. This is an economic law. If there's demand and no legal supply, illegal supply will fill the void. Second lesson: scale matters. Escobar became so powerful not because he was smarter than other traffickers, but because he was first to understand the advantage of scale. He didn't work with kilograms, but immediately moved to tons. He didn't control one route, but created many. He didn't bribe individual people, but bought entire institutions. Scale gave him a snowball effect. The more money, the more opportunities for business protection. The better the protection, the more profit. And so in a spiral. Third lesson: money itself isn't the goal. When you have so much money you can't spend it or even safely store it, it loses meaning. Escobar reached the point where money became a problem, not a solution. This is a philosophical moment. We all chase money. But what happens when there's too much? It becomes a burden. You need to hide it, guard it, justify it. Escobar's quality of life in his final years was terrible. He was hiding, running, afraid. With all his billions, he couldn't live peacefully. Fourth lesson: violence and corruption have limits of effectiveness. Escobar bought everyone he could buy, eliminated those who wouldn't be bought, but ultimately this worked against him. Too much violence united everyone against him, government, competitors, even part of the population. He became target number one. And no amount of money could protect him from everyone at once. Corruption works when it's targeted. When you try to corrupt the entire system, the system malfunctions and starts resisting. Fifth lesson: illegal business doesn't create long-term prosperity. Escobar earned tens of billions, but what did he leave? A destroyed country, thousands of bodies, a family living in exile under false names, billions buried in the ground and lost forever. No legacy, no dynasty, no monuments except monuments to his victims. Legal billionaires create companies that live for generations. Illegal billionaires create a void that collapses after their death. Sixth lesson: the highest margin often means the highest risk. Yes, Escobar earned 15,000% profit, but the price of this profit: constant threat of death, prison, betrayal. In legal business with a margin of 20 to 30%, you sleep peacefully. In illegal business with margins in the thousands of percent, you don't sleep at all. Risk and return are always connected. You can't get astronomical profit without astronomical risk. Seventh lesson: the economics of supply and demand works everywhere, even on black markets, even in illegal goods. High prices aren't traffic or greed. It's a direct consequence of prohibition. Remove the ban, and prices will drop 100 times. This is exactly what we see in places that legalized cannabis. Prices collapsed because legal production is much more efficient than illegal. Black markets thrive only where the state creates artificial scarcity through bans. Eighth lesson: corruption destroys states from within. Colombia in the 80s and 90s was practically a failed state. The judicial system didn't work. Police were bought. Politicians were afraid to make decisions. All this because of billions in illegal money that corrupted every institution. When a criminal organization earns more than the entire state budget, it can buy the state. And Escobar almost did it. Only international pressure and U.S. help stopped complete collapse. Ninth lesson: legalization may be more effective than prohibition. This is a controversial topic. But let's look at the numbers. The war on drugs has cost the U.S. trillions of dollars over the last 50 years. Result? Products are more accessible and cheaper than ever. Cartels have only become stronger. Maybe the problem is in the approach? Maybe prohibition creates more problems than it solves? This is a question each society must answer for itself. But Escobar's economics shows prohibitions on high-demand goods enrich criminals. And the 10th, final lesson: money without legitimacy has no long-term value. Escobar could buy anything except respect, except safety, except a peaceful life, except a future for his children. He was one of the richest people on the planet and one of the most miserable. He spent his last years on the run, in fear, in paranoia, slept in different places every night, couldn't trust anyone, watched as his friends and family were eliminated. This is the price of illegal billions. Now let's talk about what happened to the business after Escobar, because this shows another important economic principle. When you remove one player from the market, others take his place. The Medellin cartel collapsed, but the trade didn't decrease. It simply reorganized. The Cali cartel strengthened. Then came Mexican cartels. They turned out to be even more ruthless and efficient than Escobar. Mexican cartels learned from Escobar's mistakes. They were less public, bragged less, used terrorist methods less often that attract international attention. They diversified business, not just one product, but multiple types. They built more sustainable structures where removing one leader doesn't destroy the entire organization. Essentially, they applied corporate governance principles to illegal business. Today, more than 30 years after Escobar's death, the industry brings in even more money than in his time. According to UN estimates, global trade is valued at approximately $90 billion annually. That's 4 times more than Escobar earned in his best years. The market has grown, production has increased, prices in the U.S. have even fallen due to excess supply. The war has been lost from any perspective. This leads us to an uncomfortable conclusion. Escobar wasn't the cause of the problem. He was a symptom. The real cause: huge demand in developed countries and prohibition policies. As long as these two factors exist, new Escobars will appear, maybe with different names, in different countries with different methods. But the economics will remain the same. High demand plus prohibition equals astronomical profits for those willing to risk. It's also interesting to look at the social side of Escobar's economics. He wasn't just a criminal in the eyes of many Colombians. For the poor of Medellin, he was Robin Hood. He built houses for the homeless, gave money for food to the starving, built sports fields for children, paid for medical operations. In a country where the state didn't fulfill social functions, Escobar filled this void. This created a paradoxical situation. On one hand, he was a mass murderer and destroyer of the state. On the other, a philanthropist and folk hero. Thousands of people cried at his funeral. There are still Colombians who remember him warmly. This shows how economic inequality and state failure create ground for criminal authorities. When the legal system doesn't work, people turn to the illegal one. Escobar understood the power of populism. He invested millions in his image, not only through charity but also through media. He financed newspapers that wrote positively about him. He sponsored sports teams. He was even elected to Colombia's Congress for a short time, though later stripped of his mandate. He tried to legitimize himself through politics. It didn't work, but the very attempt shows his understanding that money alone isn't enough. You need legitimacy. Another aspect worth considering: Escobar's psychology. What drives a person who earns billions but continues risking his life? He didn't need money. He had more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he couldn't stop. This isn't about money anymore. It's about power, about control, about proving he's stronger than the system, about ego. There's a psychological theory that very wealthy people stop being motivated by money. For them, money becomes a way to keep score in a game of power, influence, status. Escobar played this game to the maximum. He challenged not just police, he challenged the state, the U.S., the entire world. And losing in this game meant death. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat. This is an important psychological lesson for everyone striving for wealth. Money is a tool, but if it becomes an end in itself or a way to feed ego, it turns into addiction. Escobar wasn't addicted to what he sold. He was addicted to the power that money gave. And like any addiction, it destroyed him. Let's also talk about Escobar's influence on pop culture. He became an icon: series, films, books, documentaries, his face on t-shirts, tours of his activity sites in Medellin. An entire industry built on his image. Why? Because his story captivates. Poor guy from the slums becomes one of the richest people in the world, challenges a superpower, lives by his own rules, dies in battle. It's an archetypal plot. But this romanticization is dangerous. It hides the real cost: thousands killed, destroyed lives of addicts, a corrupted state, fear in which an entire country lived, children who became orphans, judges and journalists killed for their work. This isn't a romantic story. It's a tragedy. But mass culture often chooses spectacle over truth. This is a lesson about how society chooses its heroes. We admire those who challenge the system, even if that system is law and order, even if the challenge leads to destruction. There's something primal in admiring a strong person who takes what he wants by force. But civilization is built on suppressing these instincts, on accepting rules, on collective good instead of individual power. Now, let's sum up all this insane economics. Pablo Escobar built a business model based on 3 pillars. First, astronomical marginality created by prohibition on a high-demand good. Second, scale of operations allowing market dominance. Third, systemic corruption and violence to protect business. This combination brought him $21 billion a year. But this same model contained seeds of self-destruction. Too much violence attracted international attention. Too much corruption destroyed state institutions, which ultimately led to harsh response. Too much money became impossible to protect and legitimize. And too big an ego didn't allow Escobar to stop in time and leave. His story is a warning about the limits of illegal economics. Yes, you can earn billions, but you can't keep them. You can't legally pass them to children. You can't live peacefully with them, and you can't build anything lasting on them. Escobar died at 44. If he had invested even 1/10 of his energy in legal business, he could have lived to old age wealthy and respected. But he chose a different path and paid the full price. For society, his story is a lesson about the consequences of prohibition policies. Escobar didn't create demand. Demand existed. Prohibition didn't destroy this demand. It simply made satisfying demand incredibly profitable for criminals. If the goal was to reduce consumption, the policy failed. Consumption only grew. If the goal was to prevent criminals from enriching themselves, the policy failed even more. Escobar and others like him became richer than legal businessmen. Alternative? A complex question. Legalization and regulation can reduce criminal profits, but create other problems. More accessible substances can increase dependency. This is an ethical dilemma without simple answers, but Escobar's economics clearly shows. The current model doesn't work. 50 years of war, trillions of dollars spent, millions imprisoned. Result? Products are more accessible and cheaper than ever. Maybe it's time to admit the prohibitionist approach has failed. Maybe it's worth trying other methods. Treatment instead of prison for addicts. Regulation instead of prohibition for less dangerous substances. Focus on harm reduction rather than punishment. Portugal tried decriminalization of all substances in 2001. Result? Reduction in overdoses, HIV infections, and related crime. It's not a perfect solution, but shows there are alternatives. Returning to Escobar. What remains of his empire? Ruins. Abandoned mansions, billions buried in the ground and lost. A museum in his former estate where tourists take photos. A son who publicly apologized for his father's actions and lives under a different name. A daughter who wrote a book about the trauma of living in the shadow of a father who was a terrorist. A country that needed decades to recover from his legacy. And what could have remained if he'd chosen a legal path, with his energy, intelligence, organizational abilities? Perhaps the largest corporation in Latin America. Universities and hospitals with his name. Charitable foundations actually helping people. Respect and honor. A family that could be proud of him, but this didn't happen, because he chose the quick money of a legal business and paid with everything. In conclusion, Pablo Escobar's economics is a lesson about the danger of prohibitions, the power of market economics even in criminal spheres, and the limits of what money can buy. His story shows that money without legitimacy is emptiness. That scale without sustainability leads to collapse. That violence as a business strategy ultimately turns against you. And that the highest profit often means the highest price. If you're interested in the topic of illegal market economics, study further. Read books on the economics of this trade. Watch documentaries that analyze rather than romanticize. Study alternative approaches to substance policy. Understand the economic mechanisms that create black markets. Knowledge is protection from manipulation and a way to make more informed decisions as a citizen. Escobar's story isn't a success story. It's a story about how the biggest money in the world couldn't buy the most important things: peace, security, and a future. It's a story about how economic laws work even where they shouldn't. And it's a cautionary tale for everyone who thinks the ends justify the means. Because in the end, the means determine not only the goal, but also the price that must be paid. And the price Escobar paid turned out to be too high even for a man who had all the money in the world.